There is a moment in Frederick Douglass's life that I want you to hold in your mind before we say anything else. He is 12 years old. He is enslaved on a plantation in Maryland. He has no legal identity, no recognized name, no rights of any kind. He is the property, the legal, documented property of another human being. And he is teaching himself to read, in secret, at night, using pages torn from a spelling book he has charmed out of the white children in the neighborhood, hiding the pages in his clothes, practicing letters in the dirt when no one is watching, risking, with each stolen hour of learning, a punishment that could have been, and sometimes was for others, catastrophic. Nobody gave him permission. Nobody cleared the path. Nobody told him it was possible, or safe, or wise, or that a boy in his position had any business reaching for something so far outside the walls that had been built around his life. He reached anyway. And what Frederick Douglass did with that reach over the next 7 decades of one of the most extraordinary lives any American has ever lived is the most radical, most honest, most permanently instructive argument for the human capacity to begin again that this country has ever produced. Not despite impossible conditions, through them, because of what they demanded. There is a story most of us tell ourselves about reinvention. We tell it like this: when the conditions are right, when the circumstances align, when the obstacles have been sufficiently cleared, and the timing is sufficiently favorable, and the risk is sufficiently manageable, then we will begin. Then we will make the change, start the work, become the person we have been privately understanding ourselves to be, underneath the version we have been performing for everyone else. And the conditions never quite align. The circumstances keep shifting, the obstacles clear on one side and reassemble on another. And the life we intended to live keeps receding, year by year, to a horizon that moves as we move, always the same distance ahead, always just slightly out of reach. Frederick Douglass did not have the luxury of waiting for the right conditions. The conditions were, by any measurable standard, impossible. He was born into a system specifically designed to prevent exactly the kind of becoming he was attempting. Every institution, every law, every social arrangement surrounding him existed to enforce a single message: you are not the kind of person to whom this is available. He decided not to believe it. Not naively, not without understanding the cost, but with a clarity and a determination that came from somewhere deeper than optimism, from the bedrock conviction that the self is not the same thing as the circumstances surrounding it, that what a person is capable of becoming is not determined by what they have been told they are. That is Douglass's first and most foundational lesson, and it is as available to you today as it was to him in 1830. Frederick Douglass was born Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey, probably in 1818. The exact date was never recorded because the births of enslaved people were not considered worth recording, in Talbot County, Maryland. His mother, Harriet Bailey, was enslaved. He saw her only a handful of times before she died when he was 7. His father was almost certainly his enslaver. He was separated from his grandmother, the only stable presence of his early childhood, at 6 years old and sent to work on the plantation. And yet, something in him refused to accept the identity that the system was working with extraordinary thoroughness to install in him, refused to become what he was surrounded by instructions to become, refused at 12 years old and in secret with a torn spelling book and a piece of dirt to remain illiterate in a world that used illiteracy as a chain. When he was 15, he was sent to a man named Edward Covey. Covey's reputation, his specific, cultivated professional reputation, was as a slave breaker, a man who could take someone whose spirit had not yet been extinguished and extinguish it, who could, through sustained physical brutality and psychological degradation, break a person down to the point where resistance was no longer imaginable. Douglass was with Covey for a year. The beatings were regular. The work was relentless. By his own account, it nearly worked. He writes in his autobiography, "I was broken in body, soul, and spirit. My natural elasticity was crushed. My intellect languished. The disposition to read departed. The cheerful spark that lingered about my eye died. The dark night of slavery closed in upon me." And then one day, August 1834, a Monday morning, in a barn, Covey came at him again, and something in Frederick Douglass, 17 years old, standing in that barn, did not move. He fought back. Not easily, not without terror. The fight lasted 2 hours, and at the end of it, Covey had not beaten him, had not broken him, would never touch him again. Douglass wrote about that moment for the rest of his life. He called it his resurrection, the moment when he discovered, not as an idea, but as a physical, embodied, irrevocable fact, that the self capable of resistance had been inside him all along, waiting, unbroken, available. That is the second lesson. The self capable of resistance is inside you. It has been waiting. It does not require perfect conditions to emerge. It requires a decision. In 1838, at the age of 20, Frederick Douglass escaped from slavery. He traveled by train and steamboat, using borrowed identification papers from Baltimore to New York in a single day. He arrived in New York with no money, no connections, no legal status, no safety net of any kind. A man who had just committed, in the eyes of the law, the crime of stealing himself. The crime of stealing himself. And what he did next, in the 10 years that followed that arrival, is the part of the story that belongs most directly to the life you are living right now. Because Douglass did not wait to be recognized, did not wait for the establishment to make room for him, did not wait for circumstances to signal that the time had come. He picked up a pen, he stood on platforms, he opened his mouth and spoke, in a voice so commanding, so precise, so devastatingly eloquent, that audiences who had come expecting a curiosity found themselves in the presence of something that reorganized them. He wrote his autobiography, The Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, at 27. It sold 11,000 copies in its first 3 years. It was translated into French and Dutch. It was read across Europe and America by people who had no framework for a book like it, because a book like it had never existed before. He received death threats. His address was published in the narrative, which meant, since he was still considered the property of Thomas Auld, he could be captured and returned. Friends urged him to use a pseudonym, to obscure the details, to protect himself. He refused. He put his name on the cover, his real name, the name he had given himself, Frederick Douglass, taken from a character in a poem by Walter Scott, chosen freely, claimed fully, belonging to no one but himself. The name on the cover of that book was an act of resistance as radical as anything else he ever did.
I want to stay with something that runs through every chapter of Douglass's life, and that I think is the most transferable wisdom he has to offer. especially to someone in midlife who is contemplating a reinvention that feels too late, too risky, too far from everything they have already built. Douglass never stopped becoming. He did not escape slavery and then declare himself finished. He did not publish the narrative and then rest on what he had accomplished. He did not deliver one great speech and consider the work done. He kept reaching, kept learning, kept revising his understanding of himself and the world in response to everything new that his extraordinary, expanding life put in front of him. He taught himself to read, then to write, then to speak publicly, then to edit a newspaper, then to navigate international diplomatic circles, then to advise a president he had publicly criticized, then supported, then pushed harder, then mourned with a grief so personal it stunned the people who witnessed it. He changed his mind, publicly, explicitly, without apology, on major questions when his understanding evolved. On the Constitution, on the best strategy for abolition, on the relationship between legal reform and moral transformation. In a culture that treats consistency as virtue and changed minds as weakness, Douglass treated growth as the whole point. He wrote late in his life, "I prefer to be true to myself, even at the hazard of incurring the ridicule of others, rather than to be false and to incur my own abhorrence. I prefer to be true to myself, even at the hazard of incurring the ridicule of others." That sentence, written by a man who had already paid costs for his truth that most of us cannot imagine, is one of the most complete statements of personal integrity in the American tradition, and it is an instruction, a permission, a direct, unambiguous invitation to stop performing the version of yourself that the room expects, and to become, as late as necessary, as slowly as necessary, as publicly as necessary, the one that is actually true. There's a speech Douglass gave on July 5, 1852, in Rochester, New York, that I want to tell you about, because it contains what I believe is the single most important insight of his entire philosophy. He had been invited to give a 4th of July address, an Independence Day celebration, and what he delivered was not a celebration. He stood before an audience of white abolitionists and said with a directness so absolute that the room went completely still, "What to the American slave is your 4th of July? I answer, a day that reveals to him more than all other days in the year the gross injustice and cruelty to which he is the constant victim." Now, I am not telling you this to make a political point. I am telling you this because of what it demonstrates about Douglass's philosophy of self and about what genuine reinvention actually requires. Douglass could have softened it, could have found a version of the truth that was easier for the audience to receive, could have framed his argument in ways that made the people in the room comfortable enough to remain comfortable while feeling virtuous. He refused, because he understood, with the particular clarity of a man who had paid in full for his access to truth, that a reinvention built on what other people can tolerate is not a reinvention at all. It is a more sophisticated performance of the same self-suppression. Real reinvention, the kind that lasts, the kind that actually changes something, requires the willingness to say the true thing even when the true thing is unwelcome, to stand in your own actual understanding of your life and speak from it, regardless of whether the room is ready. Douglass was always ready, and he had learned, at cost that most of us cannot comprehend, that being ready was the only kind of safety that actually held.
Here's what Douglass's wisdom asks of you, practically, today. First, identify the chain you have accepted as inevitable, not the dramatic chains, the quiet ones, the belief about yourself, about what you're capable of, what you are the kind of person to do, what is and isn't available to someone with your history, your age, your particular configuration of past decisions that you have held for so long it no longer feels like a belief. It feels like a fact. Write it down as plainly as you can. The thing you have been telling yourself cannot be changed, cannot be attempted, cannot be begun, not because it is actually impossible, but because the system you have been living inside has been very persuasive about its impossibility. Then ask, with Douglass's directness, not with false optimism, but with honest inquiry, is this true, or is this the voice of the walls around me, which I have mistaken for the voice of reality? Second, make one act of unauthorized learning. Douglass taught himself to read without permission, without resources, without anyone believing it was worth the effort. He reached for the tool he needed most and found a way to get his hands on it. What is the skill, the knowledge, the capability that your next self requires, that you have been waiting to acquire through official channels, through the right program at the right time with the right credentials? Begin acquiring it today, informally, imperfectly, without waiting for permission or the ideal conditions. 1 hour, one resource, one unauthorized step toward the self that is waiting on the other side of the learning. Douglass would recognize this immediately. He would call it by its right name, the beginning of everything. Third, claim your name. Not literally, perhaps, but Douglass's act of naming himself, of choosing the name Frederick Douglass, of putting it on the cover of a book, of refusing to be defined by anyone else's designation, is a practice available to all of us in the forms our lives actually take. Where in your life are you still answering to someone else's name for you? The role, the label, the version of yourself that was assigned rather than chosen, that you have been inhabiting out of inertia or obligation or the path of least resistance, long past the point where it was true. Name yourself, not dramatically, not at the expense of the people who depend on you, but in the quiet daily practice of acting from your own understanding of who you are, rather than from the understanding that the history around you has been insisting on. Fourth, say the true thing once this week. Not aggressively, not without care for the people who will receive it, but with Douglass's commitment to speaking from your own actual perception, rather than from the managed, moderated, audience-calibrated version that keeps everyone comfortable and keeps you invisible. One true thing, in one conversation, with one person who matters enough to deserve your honesty. Not the whole truth necessarily, not the truth deployed as weapon or as performance of courage, just the thing you actually think, said plainly, from the part of you that Covey could not break, and the system could not erase, and the decades of compromise have not managed to extinguish. That part.
I want to close with the image of Frederick Douglass in the last year of his life. He is 77 years old, though the exact number was never certain because his birthday was never recorded. He has lived 7 full decades of one of the most consequential American lives ever lived. He has been a slave, a fugitive, a newspaper editor, an orator, a diplomat, a United States Marshal. He has spoken to presidents and been received by queens. He has watched the institution that defined his birth be abolished, watched the amendments be written, watched the long, slow, still unfinished work of Reconstruction begin. And on the last day of his life, February 20th, 1895, he attended a meeting of the National Council of Women in Washington, came home, sat with his wife, and then, without warning or struggle, simply stopped. He did not stop becoming until the moment he stopped breathing. That is the life Frederick Douglass chose. Not the life he was given, the life he chose. Syllable by syllable, letter by letter, word by word, reach by unauthorized reach, across 7 decades of a world that spent considerable energy insisting it was impossible. It was not impossible. It was merely the most difficult, most necessary, most permanently worthwhile thing a human being can do. Begin again, from where you actually are, with what you actually have, toward what is actually true. Here is the question I want to leave you with today.
What is the version of yourself, the one that has been reaching in secret, practicing in the dirt, risking in the stolen hours that you have not yet had the courage to put your name on? Write it in the comments, because that answer, your real, undefended Frederick Douglass answer, is not a small thing. It is the spelling book hidden in your clothes, and it has been waiting, patient, persistent, and completely unbroken for you to decide to use it. I'll see you in the next one.